In a dark, spooky world where fear takes over, get ready to face the unknown. Welcome to a place where nightmares come alive, where shadows hide secrets, and every breath sends shivers down your spine. Take a deep breath as you step into a realm that will test your courage. Lock your doors, hold on to hope, for within these depths, something sinister awaits. Prepare yourself for a journey into true terror. It was midnight, and Sam Kessler was trying to believe that he was alone. He crouched against a cold tile floor and peeked out from cracked blinds, staring into the impenetrable snowstorm outside. There was nothing, no life or sound, except for the shrieking wind and the creaking of naked trees on that stormy winter night. Sam had stopped listening for the sounds of police sirens hours ago. The flurry of snow, which had greeted him upon his arrival in Massachusetts, had already begun to turn into a blizzard when he pulled off the gravel mountain road in the icy violet dusk of the evening. It would be hours before anyone could get back on those roads. He thought he wouldn't be going to prison tonight, but this was cold comfort. He knew he had not really escaped. He wasn't safe, and he certainly wasn't alone in this shameful refuge. It was a rundown motel lost in the backroads of western Massachusetts, and Sam Kessler was trapped there. He had spent the happiest days of his life mere miles from this with his family in distant summer days. He had proposed to his wife by the lake in what felt like a different century. He was snowbound and alone, but the memories brought a fleeting comfort. His present reality, however, could not be hidden from in the past, and Sam's reminiscing was cut short as the sound he had been dreading rang through the cell of a room. 3 knocks came at the motel door. When he peeked from his hiding spot beneath the window, Sam Kessler saw nothing but a thick blanket of snow at the doorstep. There wasn't a soul alive out there, but still, he stood unmoving, eyes fixed on the cold dark. A minute went by with nothing but the buzz of fluorescent lights and the pounding of his heart to break the silence, and then the knocking came again and again. The man did not move. Another minute went by, and then the sound came again. 3 knocks at the door, and again there was silence. Sam allowed himself to breathe. It was gone, at least for now. He knew his pursuer's patterns by heart. 3 knocks, then 3 again and again, and then silence for a little while. It was gone, and when he realized this, relief flooded his stiff limbs. Sam looked down at the filthy ground and slid down the plain beige wall into a crumpled heap on the cold tile floor. It wasn't long before his desperate gasps for air turned to sobs of self-pity. Sam was trapped in this room, miles away from friends or family, in a desolate motel, waiting for the thing on the other side of that door to find him. He didn't deserve this, Sam thought to himself. He knew that he was a good man, a loving husband, and a father to a wonderful son. For God's sake, he was a pillar of the community, a small business owner, and the pastor of his local church. How could anyone believe he had done such horrible things? With shaking arms and wobbling knees, Sam pushed himself to his feet and made an attempt at rationality. He kept his back defiantly turned towards the window and folded his arms across his chest in a futile gesture of protection. The room was Spartan, the barest furnishings possible crunched between 4 fading baby blue walls and a cream-colored popcorn ceiling. To his right, there was a broken TV sitting atop a nightstand, and across from it, one uncomfortable twin bed in the center of the room. It was all lit by a single fluorescent overhead light, and this cast a hopeless pall upon the unfortunate surroundings that left the environment unsuited for hope. With his back still turned resolutely to the wall, and with more than a little trepidation, Sam slowly crossed over to the bed. The bed was entirely undisturbed. Its sheets were still made up, and its pillows untouched. In the hours since he'd entombed himself in the dingy room, he hadn't as much as sat down. He'd hardly had time to throw his suitcase on the bed before the first knocks came. His luggage spilled out over the starched white sheets. He'd brought only the things he could grab in the moments before he'd fled his home that morning. He saw crumpled khakis, a pink polo, and his wife's toothbrush among the pile. It was a motley assortment, and grabbed from the laundry in his now far-off Virginia home, hardly warm enough for the biting cold of a New England winter. He ignored it all. He had to stay focused, and every thought of home tore at his resolve. He found what he was looking for next to a stale, hours-old cup of instant coffee on the nightstand. It was the room's landline. Before the will left him, Sam quickly picked up the phone and aggressively punched in 911. It took 2 rings, and a woman's voice answered the phone. 911. What's your emergency? It was the first human voice Sam had heard all night, and at the sound of it, he choked on his words. The operator repeated her question, but by then, Sam had mustered up the last of his courage. His rusty larynx gave a sound that was something between a grunt and a dry heave as he began to speak. When at last, the air he forced out his mouth again began to resemble words, he spoke fast. Hello, my name is Sam Kessler. I'm at the motel on 13 Mountain View Road. And I. He trailed off. As he searched for the right words to say to the dispatcher, the reality of his situation began to set in. Images of the cold gray morning began to flood back into his mind. The clump of yellow hair he had awoken to find clutched in his fist. His wife's terrified face, frozen cold and pale, her wide green eyes dull and absent of light. Sam remembered searching. He remembered confusion, fear, and despair fighting within him as he tried to figure out what had happened, and then he remembered the blood on the bathroom door. He tried to block out the thought. He shut his eyes and fell silent, but it seemed as if the sight had been burned into his eyelids. The naked body of his son, his only beautiful son, laid out, red wet, and cold on the white tile floor. He had been butchered, mutilated beyond recognition. His little head had been smashed into a haphazard mess of flesh and bone. His ruined face stared unseeing into the ceiling, and his teeth lay shattered all around him. The boy's blue eyes, the same cornflower color as Sam's own, had been pushed into his skull by hateful and eager fingers. The only thing that could identify this body as his beloved son were the clumps of blonde hair that still clung to his desiccated scalp, the very same blonde hair that Sam had clutched in his bloody hands. Somewhere, a world away, the operator said something in words that Sam Kessler would not hear. The only thing in his world were memories and the pounding of blood in his ears. Still, the words continued, and as they came, they became demanding, until, at last, the demands of the here and now woke him from his nightmare. Sir, are you with me? He opened his eyes, and the images were gone, vanished by the realization of what he had just done. He told them where he was, and as this fact set in, Sam was seized by panic. What had he done? They would never understand. They would never know that he had not done it, that he could never have done something like that. The woman repeated her question, but Sam had already dropped the receiver. The phone swung from its cord, and as it did, the now muffled voice repeated its unintelligible questions. In his panic and delirium, Sam did the only thing he could think to do. With a single desperate motion, he pulled hard on the cord and tore the phone from its fastenings to the wall. The voice died abruptly, and Sam threw the landline across the room. As the wire tore out from the wall, it caught the little foam cup, and while it crashed to the ground, its murky contents spilled out over the bed and onto the floor. Sam fell into a crumpled, shaking heap on the cold, coffee-soaked floor. He began to cry as he hadn't cried since he was a child. None of it was his fault, he thought, but it didn't matter. They would never believe him, and it wasn't fair. He was a good person. Why should he lose so much? Sam was racked with sobs, and the more he sobbed, the greater his self-pity grew. He clasped his hands across his eyes, shutting out all light. He wept for minutes uncountable until, at last, the voice of ever-watchful self-preservation tore him from the familiar wormhole of self-pity. He had told the police where he was, and Sam knew that as soon as the day broke and the snow could be cleared from the mountain path, they would be coming for him. He sobbed again and felt like crying, but he couldn't choke out any more tears. It was over. Sam knew he didn't have any more options. There was only one thing left to do. Sam rose from the pool of stagnant coffee. He now walked with a surer stride than he had managed since well before that horrible morning. He was going to make everything all right. Sam stopped beside his bed and began to search through his now soaked luggage. He didn't want to do this. He had never wanted any of this, but it had all happened. Sam didn't think he should suffer for something that he was certain was not his fault. At last, his hands closed around the edges of the book he had been looking for. Before he pulled it from the depths of his suitcase, a thought crossed Sam's mind. Isn't this all a sin for a reason? No, he pushed the thought aside. And he reminded himself that he was a good person. After all, how could saving his life be a sin? And then, rejecting all doubt, Sam Kessler pulled the old book into the flickering light. It was a thin-lined green paperback. The price tag still stuck across its binding, and on its front were a few simple words in a basic black font, The Lesser Key of Solomon. The book was a product of the modern world, its lettering printed en masse by unfeeling steel, but its contents were ancient. Sam thought that the book was insultingly ordinary for all the horrors it had brought upon him. When his hands brushed the yellowed pages, a giddy feeling of anticipation raced through him. The excitement felt wrong somehow. It was almost invasive, as if the feeling was not his own. He wondered again how he had come to this place. After all, he had never meant to buy the thing. It had been another capricious twist of fate that had brought this apocrypha into his hands. And then he remembered why. The sneering face of an old friend rose up from where it had been buried deep in his subconscious. Caleb, it had all been his fault. If it wasn't for that lowlife, he would never have even heard of the wretched book. If it hadn't been for him, he wouldn't be here at all. Sam was stewing now, lost in condemnation. He had abandoned his despair and, in its place, began to take up righteous anger. He found himself on his feet, turning away from the luggage and his purpose. Sam let the book slide from his hand, and he began to pace. As the pages slid from his grasp, he felt a sharp twinge of frustration. Had he not been so consumed with assigning blame, Sam would have seen the strangeness of this. That was someone else's feeling. It had come from somewhere apart and foreign to him. The invasive emotion did not break his fury, but instead, in its insidiousness, the feeling only fueled his wrath. Sam had now, without realizing it, forgotten himself. He had put aside his surroundings and turned his thoughts away from his family and what he had done to them. Instead, he thought only of the past and the bitter disappointments that lay there. Above all, he thought of the grinning face of the man he now held responsible for all of this. Sam remembered now. It had been so long since he'd thought of it, but now he was certain that none of this was his fault. He had been in college, studying theology in New York City, when he had encountered it for the first time. It had been in an antique bookstore on the Upper West Side, sandwiched between a deli and a movie theater. The interior was squat and cramped, the walls obscured entirely by unending rows of faded old tomes. The books spilled out onto tables and even the floor. Everything in sight had been covered in a blanket of dust. The place had an ancient feeling to it, one that wasn't helped by the musty old man at the register. The jury-after clerk sat in almost perfect stillness, his lips pursed behind a tangled gray beard, and his small glassy eyes staring unblinkingly at the wall. It was a miserable place, and one that Sam had not wanted to go to. He had a terribly important test he hadn't studied for, but Caleb had insisted. Caleb was his roommate, and his only erstwhile friend in the city. Sam remembered he had liked the boy at the time. His unkempt brown hair and easy smile had put him at ease, and his half-clever opportunistic jokes had endeared him to the teenager. Caleb was always laughing, and when Sam was younger, it was what he had loved best about his friend. Now the memory of the insipid cackling inspired only revulsion. Caleb had suggested the place. Sam knew he shouldn't have gone. But it didn't matter because, as in all things at the time, he had followed his friend. They had spent the better part of an afternoon in that dusty bookshop. Caleb engrossed in the esoterica, Sam listless and bored. By the end of the visit, as if by chance, Caleb had pulled the damn thing from beneath a teetering stack of old books. "Do you know what this is?" his friend had asked him. And of course he hadn't, and shook his head. "This is the original demonology. This shit is the real deal, man." Sam had rolled his eyes at that, and he'd told Caleb to shut the fuck up. But Caleb had insisted. "I'm serious, man. It's supposed to be the same incantations King Solomon himself used to summon all his demons." That was too much for Sam, and he said as much. King Solomon's got nothing to do with demons. "That's some bullshit." Caleb's eyes had gleamed at that, and as he remembered that, Sam grew all the angrier. "Well, if you don't believe me, why don't you buy it and take a look? Maybe you can even find a demon that can take that final for you." Sam had laughed. At the time, it seemed funny, and the book had only been $5. "Fine, I'll read it, but I know you're bullshitting me." At that, Caleb had only shrugged and led the way to the register, a stack of old books under his arm. That had been the last time Sam ever saw the son of a bitch. Now, alone in a motel room hundreds of miles from home, he wished he'd never listened to him. Sam hated his old friend and felt perfectly justified in that. It was Caleb's fault, not his. The death of his family, the police pursuit, everything. Of course, it wasn't Sam's fault, he thought to himself. He was a good man, and no good man would do these things on his own. Sam began to think he was the victim of a terrible crime, and he seethed against the long-dead criminal at whose feet he placed the blame. He had been isolated in cold despair, but now he wrapped himself in a blanket of hate. He didn't need to think anymore. He didn't need to worry about his actions. He knew who was responsible for this, and it wasn't himself. He could go to his grave or his jail cell, knowing his innocence, content in his righteousness. Safe in this certainty, Sam Kessler would have waited all night and into the dawn for the police to come, but it was not to be. As he sunk into the coffee-soaked carpet, book clutched tight to his chest, 3 knocks came at the door. Sam froze in place immediately, and the hot certainty of hate flooded his body in the face of terror. It was back. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew it would be. The knocks had come every hour since he'd woken that morning. First at this bedroom door, then at the rest-stop bathroom, and again, even amidst the howling blizzard. He counted the seconds. Every time, it was exactly 60 silent seconds, and it came again. He waited, but as the seconds crawled by, Sam noticed something had changed. In place of the deceptive quiet, he heard something distinct beyond the distant howling wind. He heard the murmuring of voices. It was muffled and far off, but it was unmistakable. There were voices at the door. Sam could make out the voices. The words were muffled and only just outside comprehension, but it did not matter. Sam recognized these voices, and he did not need to understand what they said to know what they wanted. He buried his head in his hands. Sam was determined not to listen. It did not matter. Even in the solitude of his own mind, he could only think of one thing: the book, the handwritten note, and his terrible mistake that night 20 years ago. He should have never touched the book, and for a while he hadn't. It had sat, forgotten in his dorm, underneath a stack of hardly opened and thoroughly unused textbooks for weeks. He'd only ever picked it up again on a whim. It was a week before his midterms, and he hadn't been prepared. He'd spent his time frivolously, and the balance was about to be due. But with a week still left, Sam wasn't ready to begin seriously studying. Instead of getting to work, he remembered his roommate's comment in the bookstore, "Maybe you can even find a demon that can take that final for you." He hadn't thought it would work. Sam knew that if he had known, he'd have never done it. After all, he was a good man, and a man of God, certainly not the type of person to summon demons. Still, his regrets couldn't change the past. Caleb had been visiting his family that weekend, and so, with the room to himself, Sam had followed his friend's ill-given advice. He had rifled through the little book without care or concern for its content, and he laughed to himself as he saw the fantastical names and sigils that accompanied the registry of demon princes. Belith, Lord of Desire; Fornius, who giveth knowledge of tongues; Astaroth, who processes the knowledge of science. The list was amusing, but none of these things could help him. Sam had been about to put down the book when he discovered a particularly worn page. It was earmarked and ragged as if the previous owner had returned to it many, many times. On this page were a name and a title: Nibirius, the 24th Spirit and Marquis of Hell. Beneath the name was a sigil for summoning and a description. It read, "He maketh men cunning in all arts and sciences, but especially in the art of rhetoric." Then Sam noticed something else. Cramped into the margins of the book were handwritten notes. The words were written in striking and elegant form, and Sam recognized them immediately. These were instructions, detailed instructions on how to summon the demon Nibirius, and the incantation he would need to do so. This was exactly what Sam had been looking for, and so he read on. He saw that, as with all the other demons he had, without any serious intent or regard for his actions, he began to read through the instructions. All he needed to do was draw a sigil, recite some words, and light a few candles. It was just simple enough that he could justify throwing away the time on what he had been certain would amount to just another idle diversion. The sigil was impossibly complicated. It wasn't the simple pentagram or upside-down cross that he assumed he would have to draw. The sigil was intricate, made up of many intersecting and deliberate pen strokes. Sam thought it looked a little like the neck of a guitar laid across train tracks. He tried to copy it out correctly, and what he produced was just similar enough to the icon in the old book that he could accept it. Next, Sam read out the incantation. Whatever the words were, they weren't in English, nor Latin as far as he could tell, not that it mattered to him at the time. Sam rehearsed the strange phrase twice before he felt confident he could remember it. And then he lit the candles, closed the blinds, and turned out the lights. He had felt silly there, sitting alone in the candlelight. He knew that if Caleb had come back early to see him like this, he'd never live it down. The thought of this almost drove him to put out the candles and drop the whole damn thing. As he remembered that awful night, Sam wished he had done just that. He hadn't stopped, though. There was something about the alluring blackness and the shimmering candlelight that drew him in. It was all too perfect, so fitting to the moment. The shadows cast swayed like worshippers at a Sunday service, and Sam had felt himself moving with them. When he spoke the incantation, it felt so natural, like breathing, so perfect. As soon as the rehearsed and half-remembered spell left his lips, Sam had felt as if he would burst, that it would work. It had to work. But at that moment, it didn't seem to. He had waited a minute, then a minute more, and nothing happened. Sam was about to get up when it came for the first time. 3 knocks from inside his closet door. When he had heard the knocks for the first time, Sam had choked. His breath caught in his throat, and his heart seemed to stop for a moment as his body adjusted to the impossible. He waited, frozen in place, for a whole minute. His only thought was, How? How could this be happening? It was impossible. It simply could not be. Sam refused to believe it, and he decided that he must have been losing his mind. Then 3 knocks came again and shattered the sweet illusion of insanity. He had to accept his new reality. The impossible had happened. All he could do was respond to it. And so Sam gave the only answer he could think of. With trembling lips and a shaking voice, he mustered his reply, a meek "Come in." With those words, Sam bid the thing in the closet entry. The hinges creaked as the door slowly opened, and out stepped his visitor. He heard the slapping sound of bare feet on the wood floor of his dorm room. Sam kept his eyes fixed downward. He had a strange feeling that if he looked up, something terrible would happen. Still, as the footsteps grew closer, he could not look away from the glimpse he had. He saw long pale legs bulging with throbbing black-blue veins. The creature advanced towards him, and as it did, Sam's heart began to pound. He felt something cold and dead touch his head. As the thing ran its eye-long fingers through his short hair, It spoke with three voices and with one. The first he heard was a woman's, soft and inviting like the first warm day of spring. "Hello, Samuel," it continued, the woman's gentle tone fading, replaced by the sunny voice of a small boy. It spoke in a cheery tone, one that would have inspired delight had its cold, dead hand not been resting upon his head. "Why have you called us here? Tell us what you desire, and we shall make it so." Then came another voice. It was an old man, stern, but somehow almost kind. "All we ask is a simple price, a single night to walk within your skin." Sam remained silent. He knew that he could never agree to this. Everything within him railed against the unnatural cost. The demon did not wait for an answer. It spoke, now with all its tongues at once. It asked, "Tell us, what is your desire?" Sam paused. He heard something new. Beneath the overlapping words of the three voices, he heard a fourth. It was monotone, and it was cruel. This was the steady voice of a predator. The wrongness of it all was palpable. The air was sick, and his blood ran cold, but somehow he answered. Against all logic and against all faith, he gave his bargain and stammered out, "A test. I need to pass my next test." It seemed such a trifling matter, so small a thing for such a price. The demon did not react, did not question his request. It only said in its voice of 3 in 1, "So it has been asked, and so it shall be done. Sleep tonight, and when you awake in 2 days' time, the price will be paid, and you shall have what you desire." And with that, the creature was gone. Without sound or movement, it simply faded into the night, leaving Sam entirely alone. Something within Sam left with the demon, dissipated into the stale air. All he had left to do that night was fulfill his end of the bargain. He had slept, and 2 days later, when he awoke, everything was different. No clear sign of change was present, nothing to indicate what had happened while his body had left him. But Sam knew that everything was different. He had spent that morning in a daze. When he returned to class, he was greeted by another student, tears in her eyes. She told him that Caleb was dead, that he had killed himself, and although he denied it all the rest of his life, Sam knew that Caleb had done no such thing. Sam never attended his friend's funeral, and in the months to pass hardly ever spared a thought for him. When he thought of Caleb at all, it was in his moments of despair, when late at night, he fell deep into his familiar pit of cold self-hatred. In that pit, he discovered hate, and he wrapped himself in it. Sam began to hate Caleb, and he blamed him for ever encountering the demon Nefarious. As he came to know this hatred for his dead friend, he forgot his shame and his sins. Sam decided that he himself was not to blame. He was the victim of circumstance, and there was no need to think about it any longer. He had regained his certainty, but in those many weeks of shame and recrimination, Sam had once again fallen behind in his studies. His final exams were not a week away, and he had no chance of passing. When he discovered his needful state, the visitor came again. 3 knocks had come at the door, and Sam, this time without hesitation, opened the door. It went on that way for years. Sam would fall into desperation. The knocks would come, and he would make a deal. Each and every time he would sleep, and when he woke, he would have everything he wanted. He stopped needing to work or to worry. He had only to open the door, and he would get his heart's desire. But there was always a price. Every time he woke, Sam would know that something terrible had happened. People would go missing. First, it was his classmates, but soon it would be his friends. They would suffer an accident or be found to have killed themselves. Sam never blamed himself. He always reassured himself that the beast was to blame. He was just another victim. In all the years since that night, Sam had rationalized his actions. He had only been 19, just a child, and children do stupid things. Now, alone and hunted, he wondered if any of these qualifiers mattered in the face of what had happened. He had built his life on his dealings with the creature that now waited in the storm. His scholarships, his business, and even his position as deacon of the church were all owed to the three voices and one. His family had been the only thing that Sam had created himself, and now even they were gone. He had kissed his wife and laid his son to bed the same night that he had traded away their lives. He had been having an affair with one of his flock. The red-haired woman had been a faithful member of his church for years and a friend of his wife. The woman had begun to harbor doubts, and she told Sam that she was going to come clean. His life was on the precipice of destruction, and it was all his fault. He had been desperate, and with the dreadful need came a familiar sound. 3 sharp knocks at the bedroom door. Sam had made the deal eagerly that night. He had convinced himself that everything was going to be ok. But somewhere forgotten and boarded up inside himself, he knew what he had traded away. The rest of his family was gone, all dead in terrible accidents and senseless tragedies. His wife and son were all that was left. Sam was alone now. There was nothing left. His whole world was inside 4 faded blue walls and a popcorn ceiling. All that was left outside was the storm and the beast in the night. He didn't even have his hatred or guiding self-righteousness. He had remembered his long-dead friend for the first time in many years. In the clarity of the memory, nothing was left but the truth. When Sam looked down at his manicured hands and well-kept nails, all he could see anymore was dried blood and clumps of blonde hair beneath his fingernails. At last, he realized it was all his own fault. The thought struck him with a leaden weight. It was all his fault. Nothing had mattered since that night 20 years ago. Everything since had been a drawn-out fantasy. There was nothing left for him but despair and the full weight of what he had done. Sam had no anger left. He didn't want to fight. He only wanted out. Sam wanted to leave the dream. He needed to forget it all and give up the ghost. He knew what would come next, and as soon as he'd thought it out, 3 sharp knocks came at the door. 3 came, and 3 again, but they did not stop there. The murmuring voices were raised. A chorus of whispers came from beyond the door. 1,000 senseless speakers united in hunger. The wind picked up, and the knocking did not stop. 3 and 3 again, it went on beyond counting. The wind howled and beat against the walls and windows. Sam gave a last look around the room, at the cell phone lying in a heap on the floor, at the coffee-stained sheets and broken television. This is what his deal had made him. This desolate motel room in the back country of Massachusetts was the measure of his life. Sam couldn't bear it any longer. He picked himself off the floor, stood up straight, and for the first time, without any illusions, Sam Kessler answered the door. I've never, ever written in a journal before in my life, but after who I met yesterday, I thought I might want to start one, for his sake and my own. I've been a therapist for about 3 years now, and I keep plenty of notes on past and current clients from our meetings that I use to refer back on during future meetings to check in with them and see how they've changed since then, either positively or negatively, and talk with them to see what more they can improve on. All of this is confidential between me and the client, but if someone else finds this journal, then client confidentiality wouldn't matter anymore because I might have gone missing by then, or worse. This all started a few weeks ago when I was initially contacted that he wanted to schedule an appointment. He didn't give any specifics about the reason he wanted therapy, just that he needed help thinking things out. Fast forward to yesterday. I called him up to my office, and he came in and sat down while I prepared my notes on the table next to me. He seemed normal at first, clearly a little nervous, which is not out of the ordinary for first-time clients. We shook hands and greeted, and I readied my notepad and pen as he relaxed on the couch. It's so nice to finally meet you, Irwin, I had said, and in return he gave a subtle nervous smile, then said, I'd prefer if you just use my last name, Delaney. I gave him a nod and a sure thing, and he returned to an expression like he was deep in thought. I tapped my pen to my notepad and began to ask him more about himself, while I subtly tied in other questions to find out what exactly he needed help with. Delaney talked somewhat enthusiastically about his hobbies outdoors, notably birdwatching, as well as only a mere bit of his seemingly expansive knowledge about plants. All the while he was clearly avoiding my questions about his reasoning for coming here, and I was starting to feel like he didn't have any other reason for coming to me besides to rattle off information that I felt the need to take notes on, such as about the ideal nesting locations of over a dozen different species of native bird species, or exactly how beneficial Douglas firs are to the local fauna. After an acceptable amount of time spent on his hobbies, I decided to inquire about his cause for seeking therapy. His slight grin, which had been gradually built up over the span of his lecture, had completely disappeared in a span of 3 seconds. He turned his head to the ceiling and drummed his fingers on his chest before letting out a deep exhale and looking back just enough to make eye contact with me. "I'm not always myself," Delaney said. I jotted down a quick note and waited a bit to see if he would follow up before I continued the conversation. "How so?" Mr. Delaney interlocked his hands together and shifted slightly on the couch. He opened his mouth halfway like he was going to speak, then closed it. I decided to continue. "Sometimes if something gets me really mad, I'm not myself." "But," Delaney quickly interrupted, stuttering, "it's not like that." Again I waited for him to follow up, then continued, "Well, whatever it is, I know it would help if you tried explaining it to me. Even if I don't get it, I'm sure talking out loud could help you understand it a bit better." Delaney spoke bluntly. "You wouldn't get it." I replied in return, "Try me." Delaney turned to face the ceiling again and clutched his hair with his hands. Reluctantly, he started to ask me about my own knowledge about the concept of alternate realities and the multiverse, to which I replied honestly that I have never thought much about other versions of our own reality. "Have you ever heard of a lady by the name of Lorena Garcia?" I shook my head. "Story I saw years ago. She just woke up one morning, just like any other, and everything about her surroundings was new. The clothes she wore to bed were different, her workplace, and even her boyfriend were all different than what she had known just the day before." I stayed silent. Everyone said she was just hallucinating, or thought of her testimony as nothing more than just another eye-catching piece of gossip in the tabloid news. "So, the reality you're living in right now with me is unfamiliar to you," I said. "Right now it's not, but sometimes, some days, some things that I might have seen every day for a month suddenly seem so new, like I don't know how it got there, or sometimes even what it is. Minutes, hours, and even entire days can just be entirely devoid from my memory, like I never even experienced them." I jotted down some more notes as he was speaking, then decided to ask more personal questions, such as how long this issue has been going on, and if he has a significant other, or if any of his family members are aware of his existential crisis. Concerning the beginning of his crisis, he gave a broad estimate that it started sometime between 4 months to 14 years ago, and regarding his family, he says he doesn't even know them anymore. I glanced at the clock to see how we were doing on time, and decided to get a few more questions in before we were finished. "Have you had any thoughts that were not yours? Ideas or notions that come into your mind that you would normally never even conceive of? You did say that sometimes you are not always yourself." Delaney shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "Yes." "Can you give me an example?" Delaney rubbed his right hand. "Freeing myself from my right arm. Just grabbing a knife, or a cleaver, or something." I caught myself from gazing at Delaney too long, and to just continue the conversation like normal. "Anything else?" Delaney gently dragged his hand along the right side of his face, then returned it to his chest. Other times, Delaney froze. "What is it?" I asked. Delaney held his hands in front of his face, then placed them back at his sides. He shook a little, and slowly began to sit up. I sat still, and admittedly began to panic a little, but remained calm as he went through his episode. Delaney began to look around the room with a look of determination, mixed in with a level of fear. He turned to look me dead in the eyes with a bitter glare. At this point I didn't know what to say, and just sat feeling dumbstruck and defenseless as Delaney's cold eyes were tearing at my mind. Almost as quickly as he began, Delaney abruptly took his eyes off of me and laid back down again, his hands returning to their original position on his chest. I quickly jotted down some quick notes. "I swapped again, just now, didn't I?" Delaney said. I tried to remain composure, but struggled to give an appropriate response. I didn't know what to think in that moment, whether I should chastise him or believe him. What did I do? I let out a nervous laugh, then hastily cleared my throat and restored eye contact with Mr. Delaney, telling him what I had just witnessed. I glanced at the clock, which Delaney saw and caught on to. "I guess I should get going just about now." Delaney stood up from the couch and stretched his arms. "If you want to, I can copy some of my notes for you to take home and refer to," I suggested, but Mr. Delaney declined. I got up from my chair and led Mr. Delaney to the door, opening it for him. "Well, I'd say we're off to a great start," I said in an attempt to raise his spirits. He raised his head to me and gave me the same, almost emotionless face he had walked in with. I slowly closed the door behind him, then shuffled to my chair, still trying to wrap my mind around what I had witnessed. I tried drinking some water to calm my mind down a bit, but thoughts about this man prodded my brain like thousands of glass shards. Should I inform the police? He's just some loony. He could cause serious harm to himself or others. What if he isn't just putting on some obscure performance for his own twisted enjoyment? Maybe. The rest of that afternoon was a blur. I remember scheduling an appointment with another client, and some time afterward dragging myself home and laying down on my bed, all the while my experience with Delaney was still fresh and poignant in my mind. Today I felt I needed some time off, and thankfully my schedule was empty, so I could have time to concentrate and write out my thoughts. Needless to say, I am curious to see how I will be able to work with Mr. Delaney, and admittedly moderately apprehensive. I snapped awake at 3 a.m. to the sound of my cell phone's rhythmic vibrating on the end table next to my bed. I picked it up and waited for my eyesight to adjust to see Delaney's phone number sitting on the screen. I sat up and cleared my throat and answered, and immediately Delaney's crackly voice came through. "Can you come to my house?" he asked. I rubbed my eyes and pondered his question for a while. "You want to schedule a home appointment?" "Yeah, I guess." A troubling thought entered my head. What if this was a plan to kill me? I started panicking, thinking of what he could be capable of. "I could still come to your office, but I just feel like I might be a bit more calmer if you could come to my house and talk with me. I think I gave you my address in the form I had to fill out." Maybe Delaney doesn't want to kill me. He's open to still coming into my office, but perhaps his mention of being a bit calmer is merely a malevolent ploy to get me to do an at-home visit, in hopes of having a better chance at a breakthrough. Delaney snapped me out from my whirlwind of thoughts, and I decided to make a choice, one I might regret in a few days' time. If this is the last entry I make, you know why. This is just a brief entry I'm writing before I head over to Delaney's. Besides the typical stationery I have, I decided to also bring a small serrated knife along with me as well, just in case. If all goes well, hopefully I won't have to use it, and Delaney wouldn't know that I brought it. I pulled up to Delaney's home. It was a somewhat quaint little house with a decently sized lawn at the end of a winding street. It was also surrounded by Douglas firs, which covered most of his property in shade. Upon pulling up and parking my car, I noticed occasional random bits and things strewn across his lawn. Mostly torn paper and beer cans, but also more unique stuff like porcelain figurines and little twigs wrapped up in duct tape and string that resembled shapes and letters. I grabbed my bag containing my pens and notepad, as well as the knife, and walked up to the door. I knocked and waited. After no response, I knocked again in a more rhythmic pattern, and again I waited. Nothing. I called out for Delaney and knocked twice more, but to no avail. I tried opening the door myself, but it appeared that it was barricaded from the other side. I glanced around before shoving the door, but it would not budge. I pulled out my phone and called Delaney's number, putting my ear up next to the door as I did so. I heard a generic electronic ringtone play from within for only a second before hearing a sharp thud, followed by another thud, and a faint shatter of glass. I called out for Delaney's name again, and in return I was treated by a loud go. I was at an impasse. At this point I could either leave or continue making fruitless attempts at getting Delaney to open the door, or at least join me outside, but I felt that it was my responsibility to help him. I reminded Delaney how it was his plan to have me here, and how much I want to help him, and to get to know his situation better. "I don't want to hurt you," Delaney said. "How would you hurt me?" I carefully inquired. Knowing the circumstance I was in, I wanted to take this conversation nice and slow so not to accidentally upset Delaney. There was no response for a few seconds. Then the door started to slowly creak open, revealing pitch darkness. I stood my ground, clutching the handles of my bag tightly. "Please come," Delaney muttered from within. I carefully stepped through the doorway, half expecting Delaney to pounce on me from out of the darkness. Delaney's arm emerged from the blackness, closing the door behind me and shutting out the only bit of light present in his house. I stepped back, trying to feel for a surface like a wall, but only ended up losing myself further into the abyss. Delaney made a few slow, clicking sounds with his mouth. Then, out of nowhere, I felt his hand grab mine, and he started leading me. I groped at my bag to make sure I still had it while still being led by Delaney's single, barely visible hand. He continued clicking until he sternly said, "Sit." Delaney let go of my hand, and I stumbled back and landed on a couch or similar piece of furniture. I could hear him rustling in front of me, and then slump onto something, releasing a sharp squeak as he did so. He spent a few seconds shifting on his seat, and then went quiet. I have assumed a new body, that which belongs to an alternate version of myself. Delaney spoke softly. "This is more than what I originally assumed. Not only can I involuntarily trade psyches with my other selves, but can also unwillingly assume their forms and their abilities." Delaney tapped his feet a few times, and I could hear the sound of a drawer open and close. I could hear several scraping sounds, and then suddenly a small flame emerged from a few feet in front of me. The orange glow was soft, but enough for me to see that it was coming from a small brown lighter, and the hand that was keeping the fire active. It was not how I remembered Delaney's hands. This hand looked more rough and significantly more pale, and his nails were a quarter as long as his fingers. He tilted the flame down to a small candle visible on a decently sized table between us, brightening the glow slightly, but not enough to make out any of his other features. I have been in this body for 4 days. Yes, 4 days now. I fumbled around my bag to take out my notepad and pen, and poked myself with the tip of the knife on accident. I asked Delaney if it was okay if I could notes, and he permitted me. I bent over and set my notepad on the table by the candle. "You know, before all this happened to me, in all honesty I planned on, well," he laughed softly for a second, "killing you." As I had started to write, I froze. I retracted my left hand and fumbled around for my bag. "You brought that knife because you thought I would hurt you today, right?" I froze completely now. I didn't know what to say. There was no way he could have seen the knife at all, even in this pitch darkness. I heard Delaney shifting again in his seat, and now in the faint glow of the candlelight I could make out a face, one that I passed off as some visual hallucination, as soon as I saw it. He shifted again, and the face receded back into the blackness. "Well, I no longer have any desire to hurt you anymore. I have become something else, something more, and I intend on you to be my witness." Without a prior thought, I started jotting down notes and focusing on saving everything Delaney told me. In that moment, and even now as I write, I believe that every singular word that came out of his mouth would be extremely important later on. After I had finished my current set of notes and had regained my ability to think properly, I decided to start asking Delaney questions. "What's with the clicking?" Delaney took a second to respond. After waking up in the early morning to the excruciating pain of my skin and flesh peeling away so my other self could take form, suddenly, as I discovered, any bright light I came in contact with would bring me great pain, so I hid away from light completely. Now lost in the darkness, I soon found my salvation in sound, and realized how much more I can see with sound than in light. I wrote more notes, then continued with another one of my burning questions. Can I see what you look like? Another brief period of silence from Delaney. I saw a faint hand grow out of the darkness and awkwardly hold the candle up. The table creaked, and I saw him. His face was colorless, his eyes were closed and looked like they had been glued shut. His nostrils and mouth were considerably larger, with the nostrils being a bit more spread apart, and his mouth, void of any lips, looked more like a crooked crevice on his face. After only a few seconds, he set the candle back down and vanished again. Now you have bore witness to my form. Since I know of no one else with your levels of courage and dedication, I hope you can understand now why I have chosen you as witness to my evolution. I was growing increasingly uncomfortable, but wanted to ask Delaney what he means when he tells me I'm his witness. At a later time, you will know everything. For right now, though, you can continue with your questions. Reluctantly, but still being exceedingly curious, I continued with more, shorter questions, such as his mental state and any recent suicidal thoughts, which he said all went away ever since his transition, although he shared in detail how he was at his breaking point the day before transforming, and how his standard bodily functions have been changed since transforming. Orange juice now tastes extremely bitter, and he feels a little slower when moving, but otherwise there have been no major body changes. After asking everything I felt the need to ask, I put my notepad away, then spent the next few minutes sitting in silence with Delaney. Finally, I decided to stand up and was about to say my farewell to Delaney, but he quickly cut me off. Stay here. I asked him why. As my witness, you must be with me. To experience any other sudden physical or psychological transformations I may have to endure. I explained that I have to help multiple people as part of my job, and have other responsibilities that I have to tend to, like maintaining my property and paying bills. Do you not understand the importance of the task I have given unto you? I am worth far more than all of those deplorable and depressive people that you surround yourself with. You have seen my new self. You know what I have become, but yet you reject the chance at bearing witness to my evolution. I felt like I was at my limit with Delaney, and said something I knew I'd quickly regret. You're delusional, Delaney. The words shot out of my mouth like bullets from the barrel of a gun. Delaney was silent for what might have been a few seconds, but for me felt like a minute. With all that I have shown you, how is it possible that you not only refuse to see what is front of your very eyes? Delaney crept forward, once again revealing his twisted face through the soft candlelight glow. But also call me delusional. I shifted uncomfortably and spoke. I don't want to have to hurt you. Delaney gave me a soft, crooked smile. Neither do I have any need to hurt you, but yet you are letting your own fear and hesitancy get in the way of being able to witness and eventually experience for yourself all that the multiverse has to offer. The smile had faded, and he put on a more serious face. Are you truly willing to forfeit the opportunity at being someone more than you could have ever imagined? To be part of something outside of your realm of understanding? I felt too dumbfounded to give an intelligible response, leaving us sitting in silence for quite some time. Perhaps my curiosity got the best of me, or maybe due to some force outside of my control I had suddenly felt willing. Maybe what he spoke of was something I had felt a yearning for in my life that I was just never aware of. Or perhaps this was all just a plot to kill me. But in that moment, and even now, sitting in Delaney's room with only a flashlight my source of light as I write, I no longer feel scared, but intrigued, and admittedly I am excitedly anxious for what is to come. I have spent the last week at Delaney's house, and except for some time outside and drives to and from the store to get food, I have spent my days monitoring Delaney and keeping him company. From time to time, I get these feelings of remorse that I just can't seem to pin down, more than what I might feel after making a short-sighted purchase on something expensive, or when I suggest a solution to one of my clients' problems that does not have the positive effect that I anticipated it to have. Perhaps this remorse stems from my feelings of my past beliefs and what I thought I knew about the world. With each passing day, I learn more and more about Delaney and feel something within myself changing as well. Am I becoming like him? Starting a few nights ago, I started getting calls from my coworkers and clients. I tried to tell them about my new job and sharing with them my hopes for the future, but as I was once foolish, so are they. Delaney told me that I shouldn't fret over them, that for now I can only pity them, but in time they will know. Today, Delaney beckoned me to meet him in his living room so that we could have a talk about something that he wanted me to know about. He set a candle on my side of the table between us and ordered me to get my journal because what he was about to tell me was, as he said, crucial information. I could hear Delaney pacing around the room before we started for a solid few minutes, then went to sit in his seat. Slowly, he began, with a slight but noticeable quivering in his voice. A revelation has been made known to me for quite some time. I forget of when I first learned about it, but now I believe you are ready for me to tell you, said Delaney. He took a deep breath in, then said in a hushed tone, "The realities I have been experiencing are not naturally made. They are man-made." "What do you mean?" I asked. "There's a plan, a secret plan brought to fruition by our federal government that aims to create realities parallel to our own as a means to transmute those of us lucky enough to be chosen into our newly created alternate selves, albeit in a very unstable manner." Delaney again got up for a few seconds, then sat back down. "I fear that possessing this knowledge and passing it to you is enough for us to both be killed, or worse." I became frightened, but Delaney helped to calm my fears. "But it is my job to pass this on to you, not just these words, but also these powers that I hold. You are growing fast, my witness, and you must know that in time you will soon have a witness or witnesses of your own, and they too will have witnesses, and soon this will spread throughout the entire world." Again that feeling of remorse prodded at my mind, and for a moment I was in a state of extreme panic, and Delaney once more had to help relieve me of my fears. Even now my mind is a mess whenever I think of what Delaney told me. A small part of me feels nervous all the time, and reading my past entries just makes the feeling worse. Who was I before I met Delaney? What was my life like before that fateful day? August 12th. I feel like I'm on the verge of greatness and power, but that I no longer know who I really am anymore. Sometimes I even feel that my own thoughts aren't even my own, if that makes any sense. When will this end? I awoke to see my skin and a little of my flesh sliding off of my entire body. I remember as I crying and writhing in pain, Delaney wearing a mask and thick black robes that he wore to hide himself from the light, came up to the doorway of my room and stood there, patiently watching on as my skin began to miraculously regrow. Blood was seeping out of the rest of my skin from the soles of my feet to the top of my head as it peeled away and then grew back. I was in too much shock and pain to think straight, but seeing Delaney give me assuring nods and remembering his promises reminded me that the worst would soon be over. Even after my skin stopped falling off shortly afterward, I was still in overwhelming agony. Delaney left and returned with a cup of water and handed it to me. Despite my arms feeling like they were impaled with millions of miniature, piercing needles, I still managed all my willpower to lift the cup to my mouth and drink. Delaney came over and reached his arms under my arms and helped me to my feet. He shook out my pants and shirt to get the rest of my fallen skin off of me. I wearily looked down and saw dozens of strips of my skin floating around in a small puddle of my own blood and covering the floor around it. "You are the same," Delaney said, sounding confused. My pain numbed over and I started hyperventilating. All this just to remain unchanged. I thought to myself as I began to fall into a state of panic and dread. Delaney began to look over my body, then abruptly ran out of the room and rushed back in with a knife in hand. "What are you doing?" I screamed. Without saying a word, Delaney thrust the knife into my arm, then pulled it out in a quick motion. He held my bleeding arm out and told me to watch. After several seconds of continued agony, nothing happened. I tried to pull myself away, but Delaney's grip was tight. For once, Delaney started to sound panicked. He tried reassuring me, but he seemed at a loss for words. "This isn't what is supposed to happen," he kept repeating, still trying to keep me still. He had his hands tight around my arms, so with no other option I decided to kick Delaney with all the power I had. The heel of my foot hit his groin, causing him to let go of me and stumble back. "You lied to me," I screeched. I put my hand over the gash in my arm and tried applying pressure to it. I grabbed several socks lying around one of the legs of my bed and wrapped them around my wound and tied them all together. Once again I screamed, calling him a liar. He was near the door, kneeled down with his head away from me. "Look at me." Delaney remained silent and defeated. I felt the anger and despair within me surging, and without another thought I ran up and with both hands tore the mask from Delaney's head and cast it away, revealing his twisted, inhuman face. He cried out and fell to his knees. I tore the thick duct tape that Delaney had used on all houses, the curtains, to seal them shut, and pushed the curtains aside, letting the hard, outside light rain in and onto Delaney's vulnerable skin. Once again, Delaney screamed even louder and tried to cover his face with his gnarled hands. The only thought on my mind in that moment was anger and a feeling of revenge. I picked up the knife he had used to pierce my arm and stabbed his arm. "What happened?" I cried. Delaney was wailing in pain. I ran the knife down his robe and tore it open, allowing more of that bitter sunlight that he despised so much to hit his tattered flesh. I could see his face start to sag and bubble up. I grabbed Delaney by his arms and ran him through the bedroom window. At first he only managed to crack it, but after another go his head broke through the glass. I shouted curses at him as I pushed him outside, the glass of the window breaking off and impaling itself through Delaney's robe. He was rolling around, trying the best he could to shield himself the sunlight. I huddled into a corner and wrapped a pillow over my head to try and shut out the sounds of his dying screams. Again, I shouted in despair, refusing to accept that all that I had believed in and hoped for during the past weeks was all a lie. After some time, when I could no longer hear Delaney, I dropped the pillow and looked outside. I could see him huddled up, with blood running out of his black robes. I got up and walked outside to him. I knelt over his body and looked him over. His already deformed body was even more deformed. His face was blackened, and I could his eyes now, which were now completely red with blood. His mouth and nose were both puffed up, and the rest of his body was covered in numerous bumps ranging in size and blood that either came from the glass shards or that had oozed from his skin. "Delaney?" I asked. Nothing. I rolled Delaney over and returned to the house. So much happened that I wanted to write all this down as soon as I could. I think I finally understand now the mistakes I made, following Delaney and believing in his lies about reaching some higher level of existence. All my feelings of dread were just from my old self trying to get me to stop, to snap out of this lunacy. I was so caught up in Delaney's fantasy that as soon as it began to fall apart, I killed him in cold blood. I feel no remorse for killing Delaney, though, and already felt willing to end his life even before he knifed me. What kind of a person have I turned into? But Delaney wasn't himself. He really was something else. He was able to live independently without any source of sunlight or vitamin D as a whole for that matter, and could move in the darkness with echolocation. I'm still split on what to think about what he mentioned about the government. Even if what he said was true, and any alternate realities are just manufactured, how could that make any sense? I felt like my mind is fractured on what to believe. I keep on reading back on what Delaney had told me, but neither side of my brain wants to agree on what's real and true. I feel like for now my best course of action is to rest and think everything over, and figure out what to do with Delaney. It was late at night. I was sleeping in Delaney's old bed and suddenly was awoken by a noise from somewhere near the front door. Thinking Delaney had risen from the dead and was out for revenge, I grabbed my journal and kicked out the window screen in the room and snuck away from the house. As soon as I cleared the Douglas firs, I came upon a man in some sort of silvery gold hazmat suit. Before I could react, he struck my chest with a rod of some kind that knocked the wind out of me, making me fall backwards. The man walked up to me, then put his hand up to a device on the neck of his suit. Patient neutralized. How to proceed? The man said in a muffled tone. 2 other hazmat suits came up and lifted me up by my arms and legs. The man released his hand, and the other 2 carried me into a van, which is where I finally passed out. Now I have woken up in a small, white room. A well-dressed, friendly lady has come in and told me that I'm going to be AARMACs, which she explained stood for the Agency for Artificial Reality Manipulation and Creation, new template for upcoming projects, and that I am expected to start on the first of these projects momentarily. She informed me that I will not be able to leave, and referred to the facility as my new home, while displaying open arms and a warm, alluring smile. The lady saw my journal sticking out of my jacket and tried taking it, but I told her that I had to write a few more things, which she allowed but said it will have to be confiscated. So here it is. Although I was wrong to follow Delaney, ultimately he turned out to be right. Now I must contend with the consequences of my actions. I hope this journal finds itself in the hands of a soul more wary than myself, either in this reality or another, or more likely these people will just throw it into a pit of fire, and this entire testimony will be incinerated and scattered as ashes. I repeat to you, gentlemen, that your inquisition is fruitless. Detain me here forever if you will. Confine or execute me if you must have a victim to propitiate the illusion you call justice. But I can say no more than I have said already. Everything that I can remember, I have told with perfect candor. Nothing has been distorted or concealed, and if anything remains vague, it is only because of the dark cloud which has come over my mind. That cloud and the nebulous nature of the horrors which brought it upon me. Again I say, I do not know what has become of Harley Warren, though I think, almost hope, that he is in peaceful oblivion, if there be anywhere so blessed a thing. It is true that I have for 5 years been his closest friend and a partial sharer of his terrible researches into the unknown. I will not deny, though my memory is uncertain and indistinct, that this witness of yours may have seen us together, as he says, on the Gainesville Pike, walking toward Big Cypress Swamp at 11:30 on that awful night. That we bore electric lanterns, spades, and a curious coil of wire with attached instruments, I will even affirm, for these things all played a part in the single hideous scene which remains burned into my shaken recollection. But of what followed, and of the reason I was found alone, and dazed on the edge of the swamp next morning, I must insist that I know nothing save what I have told you over and over again. You say to me that there is nothing in the swamp or near it which could form the setting of that frightful episode. I reply that I know nothing beyond what I saw. Vision or nightmare it may have been. Vision or nightmare I fervently hope it was. Yet it is all that my mind retains of what took place in those shocking hours after we left the sight of men, and why Harley Warren did not return, he or his shade, or some nameless thing I cannot describe. Alone can tell. As I have said before, the weird studies of Harley Warren were well known to me, and to some extent shared by me. Of his vast collection of strange, rare books on forbidden subjects I have read all that are written in the languages of which I am master, but these are few as compared with those in languages I cannot understand. Most, I believe, are in Arabic, and the fiend-inspired book which brought on the end, the book which he carried in his pocket out of the world, was written in characters whose like I never saw elsewhere. Warren would never tell me just what was in that book. As to the nature of our studies, Must I say again that I no longer retain full comprehension? It seems to me rather merciful that I do not, for they were terrible studies, which I pursued more through reluctant fascination than through actual inclination. Warren always dominated me, and sometimes I feared him. I remember how I shuddered at his facial expression on the night before the awful happening, when he talked so incessantly of his theory, why certain corpses never decay, but rest firm and fat in their tombs for 1,000 years. But I do not fear him now, for I suspect that he has known horrors beyond my ken. Now I fear for him. Once more, I say that I have no clear idea of our object on that night. Certainly, it had much to do with something in the book which Warren carried with him, that ancient book in undecipherable characters, which had come to him from India a month before. But I swear I do not know what it was that we expected to find. Your witness says he saw us at 11:30 on the Gainesville Pike, headed for Big Cypress Swamp. This is probably true, but I have no distinct memory of it. The picture seared into my soul is of one scene only, and the hour must have been long after midnight, for a waning crescent moon was high in the vaporous heavens. The place was an ancient cemetery, so ancient that I trembled at the manifold signs of immemorial years. It was in a deep, damp hollow, overgrown with rank grass, moss, and curious creeping weeds, and filled with a vague stench which my idle fancy associated absurdly with rotting stone. On every hand were the signs of neglect and decrepitude, and I seemed haunted by the notion that Warren and I were the first living creatures to invade a lethal silence of centuries. Over the valley's rim a wan, waning crescent moon peered through the noisome vapors that seemed to emanate from unheard-of catacombs, and by its feeble, wavering beams I could distinguish a repellent array of antique slabs, urns, cenotaphs, and mausolean facades, all crumbling, moss-grown, and moisture-stained, and partly concealed by the gross luxuriance of the unhealthy vegetation. My first vivid impression of my own presence in this terrible necropolis concerns the act of pausing with Warren before a certain half-obliterated sepulchre, and of throwing down some burdens which we seemed to have been carrying. I now observed that I had with me an electric lantern and 2 spades, whilst my companion was supplied with a similar lantern and a portable telephone outfit. No word was uttered, for the spot and the task seemed known to us, and without delay we seized our spades and commenced to clear away the grass, weeds, and drifted earth from the flat, archaic mortuary. After uncovering the entire surface, which consisted of 3 immense granite slabs, we stepped back some distance to survey the charnel scene, and Warren appeared to make some mental calculations. Then he returned to the sepulchre, and using his spade as a lever, sought to pry up the slab lying nearest to a stony ruin, which may have been a monument in its day. He did not succeed, and motioned to me to come to his assistance. Finally, our combined strength loosened the stone, which we raised and tipped to one side. The removal of the slab revealed a black aperture, from which rushed an effluence of miasmal gases so nauseous that we started back in horror. After an interval, however, we approached the pit again, and found the exhalations less unbearable. Our lanterns disclosed the top of a flight of stone steps, dripping with some detestable ichor of the inner earth, and bordered by moist walls encrusted with mitre. And now, for the first time, my memory records verbal discourse, Warren addressing me at length in his mellow tenor voice, a voice singularly unperturbed by our awesome surroundings. "I'm sorry to have to ask you to stay on the surface," he said, "but it would be a crime to let anyone with your frail nerves go down there. You can't imagine, even from what you have read, and from what I've told you, the things I shall have to see and do. It's fiendish work, Carter, and I doubt if any man without ironclad sensibilities could ever see it through and come up alive and sane. I don't wish to offend you, and heaven knows I'd be glad enough to have you with me. But the responsibility is in a certain sense mine, and I couldn't drag a bundle of nerves like you down to probable death or madness. I tell you, you can't imagine what the thing is really like, but I promise to keep you informed over the telephone of every move. You see, I've enough wire here to reach to the center of the earth and back. I can still hear, In memory, those coolly spoken words, and I can still remember my remonstrances. I seemed desperately anxious to accompany my friend into those sepulchral depths, yet he proved inflexibly obdurate. At one time, he threatened to abandon the expedition if I remained insistent, a threat which proved effective, since he alone held the key to the thing. All this I can still remember, though I no longer know what manner of thing we sought. After he had secured my reluctant acquiescence in his design, Warren picked up the reel of wire and adjusted the instruments. At his nod, I took one of the latter and seated myself upon an aged, discolored gravestone close by the newly uncovered aperture. Then he shook my hand, shouldered the coil of wire, and disappeared within that indescribable ossuary. For a moment I kept sight of the glow of his lantern, and heard the rustle of the wire as he laid it down after him. But the glow soon disappeared abruptly, as if a turn in the stone staircase had been encountered, and the sound died away almost as quickly. I was alone, yet bound to the unknown depths by those magic strands whose insulated surface lay green beneath the struggling beams of that waning crescent moon. In the lone silence of that hoary and deserted city of the dead, my mind conceived the most ghastly fantasies and illusions, and the grotesque shrines and monoliths seemed to assume a hideous personality, a half-sentience. Amorphous shadows seemed to lurk in the darker recesses of the weed-choked hollow and to flit as in some blasphemous ceremonial procession past the portals of the moldering tombs in the hillside, shadows which could not have been cast by that pallid, peering crescent moon. I constantly consulted my watch by the light of my electric lantern and listened with feverish anxiety at the receiver of the telephone, but for more than a quarter of an hour heard nothing. Then a faint clicking came from the instrument, and I called down to my friend in a tense voice. Apprehensive as I was nevertheless unprepared for the words which came up from that uncanny vault in accents more alarmed and quivering than any I had heard before from Harley Warren. He who had so calmly left me a little while previously now called from below in a shaky whisper more portentous than the loudest shriek. "God, if you could see what I am seeing!" I could not answer. Speechless, I could only wait. Then came the frenzied tones again. "Carter, it's terrible, monstrous, unbelievable." This time my voice did not fail me, and I poured into the transmitter a flood of excited questions. Terrified, I continued to repeat, "Warren, what is it? What is it?" Once more came the voice of my friend, still hoarse with fear, and now apparently tinged with despair. "I can't tell you, Carter. It's too utterly beyond thought. I dare not tell you. No man could know it and live. Great God, I never dreamed of this." Stillness again, save for my now incoherent torrent of shuddering inquiry. Then the voice of Warren in a pitch of wilder consternation. "Carter, for the love of God, put back the slab and get out of this if you can. Quick, leave everything else and make for the outside. It's your only chance. Do as I say, and don't ask me to explain." I heard, yet was able only to repeat my frantic questions. Around me were the tombs and the darkness and the shadows. Below me, some peril beyond the radius of the human imagination. But my friend was in greater danger than I, and through my fear I felt a vague resentment that he should deem me capable of deserting him under such circumstances. More clicking, and after a pause a piteous cry from Warren. "Beat it. For God's sake, put back the slab and beat it, Carter." Something in the boyish slang of my evidently stricken companion unleashed my faculties. I formed and shouted a resolution. "Warren, brace up. I'm coming down." But at this offer the tone of my auditor changed to a scream of utter despair. "Don't. You can't understand. It's too late. And my own fault. Put back the slab and run. There's nothing else you or anyone can do now." The tone changed again, this time acquiring a softer quality, as of hopeless resignation. Yet it remained tense through anxiety for me. "Quick, before it's too late." I tried not to heed him, tried to break through the paralysis which held me, and to fulfill my vow to rush down to his aid. But his next whisper found me still held inert in the chains of stark horror. "Carter, hurry. It's no use. You must go. Better one than two. The slap. A pause, more clicking, then the faint voice of Warren. Nearly over now. Don't make it harder. Cover up those damned steps and run for your life. You're losing time. So long, Carter. Won't see you again. Here Warren's whisper swelled into a cry that gradually rose to a shriek fraught with all the horror of the ages. Curse these hellish things. Legions. My God. Beat it. Beat it. Beat it. After that was silence. I know not how many interminable aeons I sat stupefied, whispering, muttering, calling, screaming into that telephone. Over and over again through those aeons I whispered and muttered, called, shouted, and screamed, Warren, Warren, answer me. Are you there? And then there came to me the crowning horror of all, the unbelievable, unthinkable, almost unmentionable thing. I have said that aeons seemed to elapse after Warren shrieked forth his last despairing warning, and that only my own cries now broke the hideous silence. But after a while there was a further clicking in the receiver, and I strained my ears to listen. Again I called down, Warren, are you there? And in answer heard the thing which has brought this cloud over my mind. I do not try, gentlemen, to account for that thing, that voice, nor can I venture to describe it in detail, since the first words took away my consciousness and created a mental blank which reaches to the time of my awakening in the hospital. Shall I say that the voice was deep, hollow, gelatinous, remote, unearthly, inhuman, disembodied? What shall I say? It was the end of my experience, and is the end of my story. I heard it, and knew no more. Heard it as I sat petrified in that unknown cemetery in the hollow, amidst the crumbling stones and the falling tombs, the rank vegetation and the miasmal vapors. Heard it well up from the innermost depths of that damnable open sepulchre as I watched amorphous, necrophagous shadows dance beneath an accursed waning moon. And this is what it said. You fool! Warren is dead. John Woodford, in his first moments of returning consciousness, was not aware that he was lying in his coffin. He had only a dull knowledge that he lay in utter darkness, and that there was a close, heavy quality in the air he breathed. He felt very weak, and had only a dim curiosity as to where he was and how he had come there. He knew that he was not lying in his bedroom at home, for the darkness there was never so complete as this. Home. That memory brought others to John Woodford's dulled brain, and he recalled his wife now, and his son. He remembered, too, that he had been ill at home, very ill, and that was all that he could remember. What was this place to which he had been brought? Why was the darkness so complete, and the silence so unbroken? And why was there no one near him? He was a sick man, and they should have given him better care than this. He lay with a dull irritation at this treatment growing in his mind. Then he became aware that breathing was beginning to hurt his lungs, that the air seemed warm and foul. Why did not someone open a window? His irritation grew to such a point that it spurred his muscles into action. He put out his right hand to reach for a bell or a light button. His hand moved slowly only a few inches to the side, and then was stopped by an unyielding barrier. His fingers feebly examined it. It seemed a solid wall of wood or metal faced with smooth satin. It extended all along his right side, and when he weakly moved his other arm, he found a similar wall on that side too. His irritation gave way to mystification. Why in the world had they put him, a sick man, into this narrow place? Why, his shoulders rubbed against the sides on either side. He would soon know the reason for it, he told himself. He raised up to give utterance to a call that would bring those in attendance on him. To his utter amazement, his head bumped against a similar silk-lined wall directly above his face. He raised his arms in the darkness, and discovered with growing astonishment that this wall or ceiling extended above him from head to foot, like those on either side. He lay upon a similar silk-padded surface. Why in the name of all that was holy had they put him into a silk-lined box like this? Woodford's brain was puzzling this when a minor irritation made itself felt. His collar was hurting him. It was a high, stiff collar, and it was pressing into the flesh of his neck. But this again was mystery, that he should be wearing a stiff collar. Why had they dressed a sick man in formal clothes and put him into this box? Suddenly John Woodford shrieked, and the echoes of his scream reverberated around his ears like hideous, demoniac laughter. He suddenly knew the answer to it all. He was not a sick man anymore at all. He was a dead man, or at least they had thought him dead, and had put him into this coffin and closed it down. He was buried alive. The fears of his lifetime had come true. His secret, dark forebodings were hideously realized. From earliest childhood he had feared this very horror, for he had known himself subject to cataleptic sleeps hardly to be distinguished from death. He had had nightmares of premature burial. Even after the proneness to the cataleptic condition seemed to have left him, his fears had clung to him. He had never told his wife or son of his fears, but they had persisted. They had inspired him to exact a promise that he would not be embalmed when buried, and would be interred in his private vault instead of in the earth. He had thought that in case he were not really dead, these provisions might save his life, but now he realized that they only laid him open to the horrible fate he had dreaded. He knew with terrible certainty that he lay now in his coffin in the stone vault in the quiet cemetery. His screams could not be heard outside the vault, probably not even outside the coffin. As long as he had lain in cataleptic sleep he had not breathed, but now that he was awake and breathing, the air in the coffin was rapidly being exhausted, and he was doomed to perish of suffocation. John Woodford went temporarily mad. He screamed with fear-choked throat, and as he shrieked, he clawed with hands and feet at the unyielding satin-covered surfaces around and above him. He beat upward as best he could upon the coffin's lid with his clenched fists, but the heavy fastenings held firm. He yelled until his throat was too swollen to give utterance to further sound. He clawed at the top until he broke his nails against the metal behind the silk padding. He raised his head and beat against the top with it until he fell back half-stunned. He lay exhausted for moments, unable to make further efforts. In his brain marched a hideous pageant of horrors. The air seemed much closer and hotter now, seemed to burn his lungs with each breath he inhaled. With sudden return of his frenzy, he shrieked and shrieked again. This would not do. He was in a horrible situation, but he must do the best he could to not give way to the horror. He had not many minutes left, and he must use them in the most rational way possible to try to escape his terrible prison. With this resolution, a little calm came to him, and he began to test his powers of movement. He clenched his fists again and hammered upward, but this did no good. His arms were jammed so close against his body by the coffin's narrowness that he could not strike a strong blow, nor had he any leverage to push strongly upward. What about his feet? Feverishly he tried them, but found his kicks upward even less powerful. He thought of hunching up his knees and thus bursting up the lid, but found that he could not raise his knees high enough, and that when he pressed upward with them against the lid his feet simply slid away on the smooth silk of the coffin's bottom. Now the breaths he drew seared his lungs and nostrils, and his brain seemed on fire. He knew his strength was waning, and that before long he would lose consciousness. He must do whatever he could swiftly. He felt the soft silk about him, and the dreadful irony of it came home to him. He had been placed so lovingly in this death trap. He tried to turn on his side, for he thought now that he might use his shoulders to heave up against the lid. But turning was not easy in the cramped coffin, and had to be accomplished by myriad little hitching movements, an infinitely slow and painful process. John Woodford hitched and squirmed desperately until he lay on his left side. He found then that his right shoulder touched the lid above. He braced his left shoulder on the coffin's bottom, and heaved upward with all his strength. There was no result. The lid seemed as immovable as ever. He heaved again, despair fast filling his heart. He knew that very soon he would give way and shriek and claw. There was already a ringing in his ears. He had not many minutes left. With the utter frenzy of despair, he heaved upward again with his shoulder. This time, There was a grating sound of something giving above. The sound was like the wild peal of thousands of bells of hope to John Woodford's ears. He heaved quickly again and again at the lid. Paying no attention to the bruising of his shoulder, he pressed upward with every ounce of his strength. There was another grating sound, then a snap of metal fastenings breaking, and as he shoved upward with convulsive effort, the heavy metal lid swung up and over and struck the stone wall with a deep clang. A flood of cold air struck him. He struggled up over the coffin's side, dropped a few feet to a stone floor, and lay in a huddled mass. It was minutes before he had mastered himself and summoned enough strength to stand up. He stood inside a little vault that held no coffin but his own. Its interior was in darkness, save for a dim shaft of starlight that came through a tiny window high up in one wall. John Woodford stumbled to the vault's heavy iron doors and fumbled at their lock. He had an uncontrollable horror of this place that had almost been the scene of his perishing. The coffin there on the shelf, with its lid leaning against the stone wall, seemed gaping for him with its dark, cavernous mouth. He worked frantically at the lock. What if he were not able to escape from the vault? But the heavy lock was easily manipulated on the inside, he found. He managed to turn its tumbler and shoot its bar, and then the heavy iron doors swung open. John Woodford stepped eagerly out into the night. He stopped on the vault's threshold, closing the doors behind him, and then looking forth with inexpressible emotions. The cemetery lay in the starlight before him as a dim, ghostly city of looming monuments and vaults. Little sheets of ice glinted here and there in the dim light, and the air was biting in its cold. Outside the cemetery's low wall blinked the lights of the surrounding city. Woodford started eagerly across the cemetery, unheeding of the cold. Somewhere across the lights of the city was his home, his wife, and somewhere his son, thinking him dead, mourning him. How glad they would be when he came back to them, alive. His heart expanded as he pictured their amazement and their joy at his return. He came to the low stone wall of the cemetery and clambered quickly over it. It was apparently well after midnight, for the cars and pedestrians in sight in this suburban section were few. Woodford hurried along the street. He passed people who looked at him in surprise, and only after some time did he realize the oddness of his appearance. A middle-aged man clad in a formal suit and lacking hat and overcoat was an odd person to meet on a suburban street on a winter midnight. But he paid small attention to their stares. He did turn up the collar of his frock coat to keep out the cold, but he hardly felt the frigid air and the emotions that filled him. He wanted to get home, to get back to Helen, to witness her stupefaction and dawning joy when she saw him return from the dead, living. A streetcar came clanging along, and John Woodford stepped quickly out to board it, but almost as quickly stepped back. He had mechanically thrust his hand into his pocket and found it quite empty. That was to be expected, of course. They didn't put money in a dead man's clothes. No matter, he would soon be there on foot. As he reached the section in which his home was located, he glanced in a store window in passing and saw on a tear-sheet calendar a big black date that made him gasp. It was a date 10 days later than the one he last remembered. He had been buried in the vault for more than a week. More than a week in that coffin. It seemed incredible, terrible. But that did not matter now, he told himself. It would only make the joy of his wife and son the greater when they found he was alive. To Woodford himself it seemed as though he were returning from a journey rather than from the dead. Returned from the dead. As he hastened along the tree-bordered street on which his home was located, he almost laughed aloud as he thought of how amazed some of his friends would be when they met him. They would think him a ghost or a walking corpse, would perhaps shrink in terror from him at first. But that thought brought another. He must not walk in on Helen too abruptly. The husband she had buried 10 days ago must not appear too suddenly, or the shock might easily kill her. He must contrive somehow to soften the shock of his appearance, must make sure that he did not startle her too much. With this resolve in mind, when he reached his big house, set well back from the street, Woodford turned aside through the grounds instead of approaching the front entrance. He saw windows lighted in the library of the house, and he went toward them. He would see who was there, would try to break the news of his return gently to Helen. He silently climbed onto the terrace outside the library windows and approached the tall easements. He peered in. Through the silken curtains inside, he could clearly see the room's soft-lit interior, cozy with the shelves of his books and with the lamps and fireplace. Helen, his wife, sat on a sofa with her back partly toward the window. Beside her sat a man that Woodford recognized as one of their closest friends, Curtis Dawes. The sight of Dawes gave Woodford an idea. He would get Dawes outside in some way and have him break the news of his return to Helen. His heart was pounding at the sight of his wife. Then Curtis Dawes spoke, his words dimly audible to Woodford outside the window. "Happy, Helen?" he was asking. "So happy, dear," she answered, turning toward him. Out in the darkness, Woodford stared in perplexed wonder. How could she be happy when she thought her husband dead and buried? He heard Curtis Dawes speaking again. "It was a long time," the man was saying. "Those years that I waited, Helen." She laid her hand tenderly on his. "I know, and you never said a word. I respected so your loyalty to John." She looked into the fire musingly. "John was a good husband, Kurt. He really loved me, and I never let him guess that I didn't love him, that it was you, his friend, I loved. But when he died, I couldn't feel grief. I felt regret for his sake, of course, but underneath it was the consciousness that at last you and I were free to love each other." Dawes' arm went tenderly around her shoulder. "Darling, you don't regret that I talked you into marrying me right away. You don't care that people may be talking about us. I don't care for anything but you," she told him. "John was dead. Young Jack has his own home and wife, and there was no reason in the world why we should not marry. I'm glad that we did." In the darkness outside the window, a stunned, dazed John Woodford saw her lift an illumined face toward the man's. "I'm proud to be your wife at last, dear, no matter what anyone may say about us," he heard. Woodford drew slowly back from the window. He paused in the darkness under the trees, his mind shaken, torn. So this was his homecoming from the tomb. This was the joy he had anticipated in Helen when he returned. It couldn't be the truth. His ears had deceived him. Helen could not be the wife of Curtis Dawes. Yet part of his mind told him remorselessly that it was true. He had always sensed that Helen's feeling for him was not as strong as his for her, but that she had loved Dawes he had never dreamed. Yet now he remembered Dawes' frequent visits, the odd silences between him and Helen. He remembered 1,000 trifles that spoke of the love which these two had cherished for each other. What was he, John Woodford, to do? Walk in upon them and tell them that they had been premature in counting him dead, that he had come back to claim his position in life and his wife again? He couldn't do it. If Helen during those years had wavered in the least in her loyalty to him, he would have had less compunction. But in the face of those years of silent, uncomplaining life with him, he couldn't now reappear to her and blast her newfound happiness and blacken her name. Woodford laughed a little bitterly. He was then to be an Enoch Arden from the tomb. A strange role, surely, yet it was the only one open to him. What was he to do? He couldn't let Helen know now that he was alive, couldn't return to the home that had been his. Yet he must go somewhere. Where? With a sudden leap of the heart, he thought of Lack, his son. He could at least go to Jack, let his son know that he was living. Jack at least would be overjoyed to see him, and would keep the fact of his return secret from his mother. John Woodford, with that thought rekindling a little his numbed feelings, started back through the trees toward the street. Where he had approached the house but minutes before with eager steps, he stole away now like a thief fearful of being observed. He reached the street and started across the blocks toward the cottage of his son. Few were abroad, for the cold seemed increasing, and it was well past midnight. Woodford mechanically rubbed his stiffened hands as he hurried along. He came to his son's neat little white cottage, and felt relief as he saw lights from its lower windows also. He had feared that no one would be up. He crossed the frozen lawn to the lighted windows, intent on seeing if Jack were there and if he were alone. He peered in, as he had done at his own home. Jack was sitting at a little desk, and his young wife was perched on the arm of his chair and was listening as he explained something to her from a sheet of writing on the desk. John Woodford, pressing his face against the cold window pane, could hear Jack's words. "You see, Dorothy, we can just make it by adding our savings to Dad's insurance money," Lack was saying. "Oh, Jack," cried Dorothy happily. "And it's what you've wanted so long, a little business of your own." Jack nodded. "It won't be very big to start with, but I'll make it grow. All right. This is the chance I've been hoping for, and I'm sure going to make the most of it." "Of course," he said, his face sobering a little. "It's too bad about Dad going like that. But seeing that he did die, the insurance money solves our problems of getting started. Now you take the overhead," he said, and began unreeling a string of figures to the intent Dorothy. John Woodford drew slowly back from the window. He felt more dazed and bewildered than ever. He had forgotten the insurance he had carried, which he had intended to give Jack his start. But of course, he saw now, it had been paid over when he was believed dead. He was not dead, but living. Yet if he let Jack know that, it meant the end of his son's long-desired opportunity. Jack would have to return the insurance money to the company, wrecking his dreamed-of chance. How could he let him know then? He, John Woodford, had already decided that he must remain dead to his wife, and therefore to the world. He might as well remain so to his son also. It was for the best. John Woodford melted away from the cottage into the darkness. When he reached the street, he stood in indecision. A freezing wind had begun to blow, and he felt very cold without an overcoat. Mechanically, he turned his coat collar closer around his neck. He tried to think about what he must do. Neither Helen nor Jack must know that he was living, and that meant that no one in the city must know. He must get out of the town to some other place, take up life under some other name. But he would need help, money, to do that. Where was he to get them? Barred as he was from calling on his wife or son, to whom could he come for help without letting his return become generally known? Howard Norse. The name came at once to Woodford's lips. Norse had been his employer, head of the firm where Woodford had held a position for many years. Woodford had been one of his oldest employees. Howard Norse would help him to get a position somewhere else, and would keep his reappearance secret. He knew where Norse's residence was, several miles out in the country. But he couldn't walk that far, and he had no taxi or trolley fare. He would have to telephone Norse. Woodford walked back toward the city's central section, head bent against the piercing cold wind. He succeeded in finding an all-night lunchroom whose proprietor allowed him to use the telephone. With cold, stiffened fingers, he dialed Norse's number. Howard Norse's sleepy voice soon came over the wire. "Mr. Norse, this is Woodford, John Woodford," he said quickly. There was an incredulous exclamation from Howard Norse. "You're crazy. John Woodford's been dead and buried for a couple of weeks." "No, I tell you it's John Woodford," insisted Woodford. "I'm not dead at all. I'm as living as you are. If you'll come into town for me, you'll see for yourself. I'm not likely to drive to town at 2 in the morning to look at a maniac." Norse replied acidly. "Whatever your game is, you're wasting your time on me." "But you've got to help me," Woodford cried. "I've got to have money, a chance to get out of the city without anyone knowing. I gave your firm my services for years, and now you've got to give me help." "Listen to me, whoever you are," snapped Norse over the wire. "I was bothered long enough with John Woodford when he was living. He was so inefficient we have kicked him out long ago, if we hadn't been sorry for him. But now that he's dead, you needn't think you can bother me in his name. Good night." The receiver clicked in Woodford's unbelieving ear. He stared at the instrument. So that was what they had really thought of him at the firm, there where he had always thought himself one of the most highly valued of employees. But there must be someone upon whom he could call for help. Someone he could convince that John Woodford was still living. Someone who would be glad to think that he might be living. What about Willis Gran? Gran had been his closest friend next to Curtis Dawes. He had lent money more than once to Woodford in the past, and certainly should be willing to do so now. Hastily, Woodford called Gran's number. This time he was more careful in his approach when he heard the other's voice. "Willis, I've got something to tell you that may sound incredible, but you've got to believe, do you hear?" he said. "Who is this, and what in the world are you talking about?" demanded Gran's startled voice. "Willis, this is John Woodford. Do you hear? John Woodford. Everyone thinks I'm dead, but I'm not. And I've got to see you." "What?" cried the other's voice over the telephone. "Why, you must be drunk. I saw Woodford lying in his coffin myself, so I know he's dead. I tell you, it's not so. I'm not dead." Woodford almost screamed. "I've got to get some money, though, to get away from here, and you must lend it to me. You always lent it to me before, and I need it now worse than ever I did. I've got to get away." "So that's it," said Willis Gran. "Because I used to help Woodford out, you think you can get money from me by just calling me up and pretending that you're he. Why, Woodford himself was the biggest pest in the world with his constant borrowings. I felt almost relieved when he died. And now you try to make me believe that he's come back from the dead to pester me again. But he never died. I'm John Woodford, really." Woodford protested vainly. "Sorry, old top," returned Gran's mocking voice. "Next time pick a living person to impersonate, not a dead one." He hung up. John Woodford slowly replaced the receiver and made his way out to the street. The wind was blowing harder, and now was bringing with it clouds of fine snow that stung against his face like sand. He shivered as he stumbled along the streets of dark shops, his body freezing as his mind was frozen. There was no one from whom he could get help, he saw. His paramount necessity was still to get out of the city, and to do that he must rely on himself. The icy blasts of the snow-laden wind penetrated through his thin coat. His hands were shaking with the cold. A sign caught Woodford's eye, the illuminated beacon of a relief lodging house. At once he made his way toward it. He could at least sleep there tonight. It started from the city in the morning. The shabby men dozing inside in chairs looked queerly at him as he entered. So did the young clerk to whom he made his way. I'd like to stay here tonight," he said to the clerk. The clerk stared. "Are you trying to kid me?" Woodford shook his head. "No, I'm penniless, and it's cold outside. I've got to stay somewhere." The clerk smiled disdainfully. "Listen, fellow, no one with duds like yours is that hard up. Scram before I call a cop." Woodford looked down at his clothes, his frock coat, and stiff white shirt, and gleaming patent leather shoes, and understood. He said desperately to the clerk, "But these clothes don't mean anything. I tell you, I haven't a penny. Will you beat it before I have you thrown out of here?" the clerk demanded. Woodford backed toward the door. He went outside again into the cold. The wind had increased and more snow was falling. The front of Woodford's coat was soon covered with it as he pushed along. It came to him as a queer joke that the splendor of his funeral clothes should keep him from getting help now. He couldn't even beg a passerby for a dime. Who would give to a panhandler in formal clothes? Woodford felt his body quivering and his teeth chattering from sheer cold. If he could only get out of the blast of the icy wind. His eyes sought desperately along the street for a hallway where he might shelter himself. He found a deep doorway and crouched down inside it, out of the wind and driving snow. But hardly had he done so when a heavy step paused in front of him, and a nightstick rapped his feet smartly. An authoritative voice ordered him to get up and go home. Woodford did not try to explain to the policeman that he was not a drunken citizen fallen by the way. He got wearily to his feet and moved on along the street, unable to see more than a few feet ahead for the whirl of snow. The snow on which he was walking penetrated the thin shoes he wore, and his feet were soon even colder than the rest of his body. He walked with slow, dragging steps, head bent against the storm of white. He was dully aware that the dark shops beside him had given way to a low stone wall. With a sudden start, he recognized it as the wall of the cemetery which he had left but hours before, the cemetery containing the vault from which he had escaped. The vault. Why hadn't he thought of it before? He asked himself. The vault would be a shelter from the freezing wind and snow. He could stay there for the night without anyone objecting. He paused, feeling for a moment a little renewal of his former terrors. Did he dare go back into that place from which he had struggled to escape? Then an extra strong blast of icy air struck him and decided him. The vault would be shelter, and that was what his frozen body craved more than anything else. Stiffly he climbed over the low stone wall and made his way through the cemetery's whitened monuments and vaults toward the one from which he had escaped. The driving snow covered his tracks almost as he made them. As he trudged toward the vault, he reached it and tried its iron doors anxiously. Suppose he had locked them when he left. But to his relief they swung open, and he entered and shut them. It was dark inside, but he was out of the wind and snow now, and his numbed body felt a little relief. Woodford sat down in the corner of the vault. It was a shelter for the night, at least. It seemed rather ironic that he had had to come back here for shelter, but it was something to be thankful for that he had even this. In the morning, when the storm was over, he could leave without anyone seeing and get out of the city. He sat listening to the wind and snow shriek outside. The stone floor of the vault was very cold, so cold that he felt his limbs stiffening and cramping, and finally he stood up unsteadily and paced to and fro in the vault, chafing his arms and hands. If he had only a blanket, or even a heavy coat, to lie upon, he'd freeze there upon the stone floor. Then as he turned in his pacing, he bumped into the coffin on the shelf, and a new idea was born in his mind. The coffin. Why, the interior of it was lined deep with silk and satin padding. It would be warm in the coffin. He could sleep in it far better than on the cold stone floor. But did he dare to re-enter it? Again Woodford felt faintly the former terrors he had experienced when he had awakened in it, but they meant nothing, he told himself. He would not be fastened in, this time, and his frozen flesh yearned for the warmth of the coffin's lining. Slowly, carefully, he climbed up and lowered himself into the coffin and stretched out. The silk and padding he sank into had a grateful warmth. He lowered his head upon the soft little pillow with a sigh of relief. This was better. He experienced an almost luxurious comfort now, but after he had lain for a little while he felt that the top of his body was still cold, where the cold air came into the open coffin's top. That cold air entering kept him from being completely warm. If the lid above him were just closed to keep out the cold air. He reached up and got the edge of the heavy metal lid, then let it down upon himself. He was completely in the dark, now, inside the closed coffin. But he was warm, too, for the lid kept out the cold air. And he was getting warmer all the time, as his body warmed up the interior. Yes, it was far more comfortable with the lid closed. And even warmth now pervaded his whole being, and the air inside the coffin was still getting warmer and thicker. He felt a little drowsy now, as he breathed that warm air, felt luxuriously sleepy as he lay on the soft silk. It was getting a little harder to breathe, somehow, as the air became thicker. He ought really to raise the coffin lid and let in some fresh air, but it was so warm now, and the air outside was so cold, and he was more and more sleepy. Something dim and receding in his fading consciousness told him that he was on the way to suffocation. But what if he was his sleepy thought. He was better off in here than back in the world outside. He had been a fool ever to fight so hard before to get out of his warm, comfortable coffin, to get back to that outside world. No, it was better like this, the darkness and the warmth, and the sleep that advanced. Nobody would ever know that he had awakened at all, that he had been away from here at all. Everything would be just as before, and with that comforting assurance, John Woodford was swept farther and farther down the dark stream of unconsciousness from which this time there would be no returning.